All right. This is essentially my last recording of the respiratory system. Basically, how we neurologically regulate the breathing process. Um, so basically, the reason why I'm saving this for last, I was thinking about doing this earlier, and even after just recently teaching this, I started to realize that this was something that was better. This subject was better suited for after talking about lots of physiologic aspects of the respiratory system, especially like the mechanics of ventilation, and then discussing how we transport gases and how carbon dioxide behaves like an acid, even though it's not one, but it essentially behaves like one. And understanding the basics of that information, I think, it creates a smoother transition into really understanding how the nervous system essentially regulates the breathing process. So what we'll do is we'll just kind of talk about some various factors that regulate breathing, and then what we'll do is we'll talk about the brain's influence on the breathing process, and then we'll essentially talk about chemoreceptors and kind of mixed in here other factors that essentially influence um, the breathing process as well. All right. So basically, when it comes to regulatory factors, basically what we regulate that affects our breath rate, it's going to be carbon dioxide in pH and PO2. Remember, when you see P, that is partial pressure. Now, I'll tell you right now, and I'll talk about this more as we go. Basically, we spend a lot more time regulating uh, carbon dioxide levels and pH than we do oxygen. All right, because most of our receptors, both peripheral and central receptors, are a lot more sensitive to, like I said, pH changes than they essentially are changes in the partial pressure of oxygen. All right, a lot of that has to do with the fact that most of the oxygen in the body is bound to hemoglobin, so the receptors don't essentially come in a lot of direct contact with oxygen. Whereas being that carbon dioxide is a lot more dissolvable in water. Um, and we create a lot more mixing of CO2 and water, create carbonic acid, which is a weak acid, gets rid of its hydrogen ions, which will drop pH. That's essentially why those receptors, the receptors that regulate this process, are a lot more sensitive to pH and CO2 versus oxygen. All right, and one of the things to think about about breathing in general is that this is one of the rare functions of the human body where we have both conscious and unconscious control over the process. Okay, there's both conscious and unconscious control. So, and that's also kind of one of the influential factors of breathing. From your motor cortex in the brain, you can essentially stimulate yourself to, you know, change your depth and rate of breathing. All right. So, I mean, I just voluntarily made myself do that. However, this is primarily an unconscious process. So, and basically, breathing is an unconscious process due to the constant monitoring and input, the constant monitoring of PCO2 and pH, and the constant input to the brain, to the unconscious areas of the brain, essentially, that regulate this process. So, essentially, the unconscious parts of the brain more or less override the voluntary aspects of this, which is a good thing anyway, because it would be a living pain in the butt to have to voluntarily deal with this process. Um, so that's kind of something to keep in mind there with that. Um, so that's essentially regulatory factors. And when we think about the brain in terms of breathing centers, well, let's kind of review some brain function here for a second. So when we think about how the brain works, basically, uh, when we look at the brain, you've got the cerebrum, then you've got the brain stem. All right, that's a horrific brain stem. Then you've got your cerebellum. All right, remember I'm doing this with a very cheap tablet here, and I just think it art anyway. Now, one of the things to think about is that is that literally physically when you go higher up in the brain, the the functions become more complex and overall are just higher. All right. Whereas the highest functional aspect of being alive, essentially, in a complicated organism that has a brain and a cerebrum and so on, is consciousness. All right, and the idea of being awake, of being alert, of basically higher formulating a higher level understanding of the environment, like language, using the environment, like art for art or using tools or whatnot for survival purposes. Those are very high level functions that require very complicated high level circuitry, basically neuronal connections, and the cerebral cortex is incredibly complicated. Whereas the opposite goes the lower you go in the brain. Basically, physically, the lower you go in the brain, the more subconscious and essentially primitive or basic the functions get. All right, and when you get to the lowest points of the brain, when we're talking about essentially the brain stem, basically these functions are just simple reflexes: input, processing, output. Okay, and the processing is very simple, just input, process, output. So basically, stimulus, control center, and then output to an effector organ. All right, very, very simple circuitry. All right, whereas when we're talking about higher areas of the brain, we're talking about lots of interneurons. We're talking about centers communicating with one another to formulate and plan and create very complex high level functions. All right, so basically breathing is one of those lower level functions. Now, when I say lower level, it doesn't mean it's not important. We all know that breathing is important. However, it's in terms of the regulation of breathing. It doesn't require a whole lot of higher level processing and thought. It basically is about monitoring the partial pressure of gases and the pH of blood. And it simply put, if we accumulate too much CO2 in the system, then we have to breathe more. We have to ventilate more. If we don't have enough CO2 in the system and our pH rises, we have to breathe less. All right. And that happens sometimes in people. If people hypoventilate and they accumulate too much CO2, that's what we would call hypercapnia. And vice versa. If people hyperventilate and blow out too much CO2, then we would call that hypocapnia. All right. And that's something I'll talk about much later on in acid-base balance and more pathophys type topics. But anyway, let's kind of get back on track here with the actual respiratory process itself. I just think it's important to explain that to y'all, because this, again, just understanding that basic concept is very important. Now, so basically, anywhere below the cerebral cortex, the highest part of the cerebrum, i.e., the brain itself, anywhere below that, we're looking at subconscious control. And the further down we go, the more simple the circuitry gets. Basically, the simple the neuronal pathways get, and the more basic the functions. All right, basically something like when your bladder fills with blood, and you start generating impulses to your micturition center, your brainstem, and then you generate impulses right back down to your bladder, make it contract, and you have to pee. Very simple circuitry, very simple functions. Okay. So basically, breathing is a combination effort from the medulla oblongata and the pons. All right, from the medulla and the pons. Now, basically, the way I like to think of this is that the primary center for breathing is located in the medulla oblongata, and that basically is what we refer to as the dorsal respiratory group. Okay, basically a group of neurons that we classify as what are called I neurons. The I stands for inspiratory. Okay, inspiratory neurons. Okay, and basically these neurons generate action potentials or generate impulses down the spinal cord and out through the phrenic nerve to the diaphragm. Remember the phrenic nerve. That's the nerve that innervates the diaphragm, and then remember your diaphragm is your main muscle of breathing. Okay, so basically this dorsal respiratory group is basically the main firing center of breathing, and all these other structures basically either agonize or antagonize, basically work with or work against this dorsal respiratory group. All right. Now, what's interesting is the ventral respiratory group in the medulla contains both inspiratory and expiratory neurons, and I mean, it should clearly make sense to you that these two neurons would obviously antagonize or work opposite from one another. Right? They would work they would work against one another. So remember, inspiratory neurons promote inspiration, expiratory neurons promote expiration. And it's kind of believed that these neurons have kind of oscillating membrane potentials, oscillating, kind of like the pacemaker cells in the heart, that have those kind of that sense of automaticity. Now, it's not really. Again, one thing you have to understand about the neurological side of breathing in humans, it is terribly understood to this day. So a lot of what I'm telling you is just kind of the best ideas or theories behind this, and this is kind of one of the ideas here, is that it's believed that the oscillating activity of these inspiratory expiratory neurons, influence our patterns of inhalation, exhalation, and could exert some influence over this dorsal respiratory group as well. All right. So remember that those words of ventral and dorsal. Ventral means towards the belly or towards the front. Dorsal means the back. All right, and then the pons. Now the pons doesn't directly stimulate the firing of breathing. However, the pons basically influences the activity of the medulla. Okay, and there's a center called the apneustic center that promotes inspiration by basically stimulating or increasing activity of that dorsal respiratory group. And then there's another center called the pneumotaxic center that basically does the exact opposite. All right, sends inhibitory signals to that dorsal respiratory group. All right, so that's kind of and so that's kind of something to think about then. And this is where a lot of animal studies have been done, where they've, for example, gone in and damaged and destroyed parts of the pons where we know that these neurons are located, and then they've seen the effects of this. Basically, these changes in the animals. Now, if we want to actually look at the locations of these areas, so basically, if we're looking at the medulla, basically we've got these two groups that are basically found in the reticular formations of the medulla. And remember, we've got a group that's ventral and we've got a group that's dorsal, right? And the dorsal respiratory group, remember, is the primary the instigator of breathing, essentially, because it primarily generates it. The neurons from here branch down to the spinal cord and then out through the phrenic nerve and then to the diaphragm. And then, like I said, all these other areas essentially influence the activity of the dorsal respiratory group. All right. And then we've got and then essentially up in the pons, we've got a couple areas here. Okay, and again, I'm not drawing these to complete accuracy or scale, so try not to be too picky about that. But basically here, I'm just going to abbreviate this P and A. So this would be the pneumotaxic center, and this would be the apneustic center. And remember that the apneustic center basically promotes the eye neuron, the inspiratory neuron activity of basically of the medulla oblongata, and helps promote inspiration, whereas the pneumotaxic center does the exact opposite. It inhibits inspiration. Okay, and then the combination or the culmination of the activities of essentially all of these centers interacting with one another, they basically help us control our depth and rate of breathing. All right, because for example, if we're breathing in, if we're inhaling, we're only going to inhale so much, and then our expiratory neurons are going to fire, inhibit inspiration, and then exhalation will occur. Now, there's a variety of input or variety of information that basically coming in from the peripheral aspects of the body that essentially influence the activity of these centers of the brain. So, and remember, like I said before, the biggest influences of breathing are essentially blood chemistry, right? They're essentially blood chemistry. So, And basically, there are types of receptors that are sensitive to changes in our blood and or body fluid chemistry that are called chemoreceptors, all right? And these chemoreceptors are essentially sensitive to changes in pH. Okay, and these chemoreceptors are located in two areas. We have peripheral chemoreceptors and we have central chemoreceptors. So central chemoreceptors, these are located in the medulla, the more specifically the medulla. I'm just going to abbreviate that, oblongata. And peripheral chemoreceptors, they're located pretty much pretty close to the same areas as the baroreceptors that help us regulate blood pressure in the aortic arch and in the carotid bodies. All right, except even though they're located in similar areas, their functionalities are very different because they're monitored. Because remember, baroreceptors are mechanoreceptors; they're sensitive to changes in stretch and pressure, whereas chemoreceptors are sensitive to changes in basically fluid chemistry. All right. All right, so that's kind of something to keep in mind. I'm going to revisit these chemoreceptors in a little bit. There are other factors that influence basically activity of the respiratory system, and one of those factors would be the stretch of the lungs. All right, would be stretch of the lungs. If we inhale a lot of air and our lungs stretch out a lot, that's going to basically, that's called the Hering-Breuer reflex, and that's the Hering-Breuer reflex, the inflation reflex that's associated with that, because there's an inflation and a deflation reflex there. If we inflate our lungs too much, all right, our lungs are sensitive to, basically sensitive to that stretch, so we're going to generate impulses up to the brain, and as a result, that is going to cause an inhibition of inhaling, and it's going to stimulate exhaling. So we're going to inhibit I neurons and excite E neurons and promote expiration. All right. And it's the exact opposite when we deflate the lungs. All right, when the lungs are getting deflated too much, basically what's going to happen here are the again, the E neurons will be inhibited, I neurons excited. Joint and muscles, basically, there's lots of input, during physical activity that influences breath rate, with mechanical changes with those tissues, and that essentially will cause an increase in breath rate. There is influence from higher brain centers like your limbic system. And remember, your limbic system is a very old, primitive part of the brain that is essentially responsible for emotions. And I mean, especially a lot of your raw, like animalistic emotions, like anger. I mean, all emotions, but I mean, there's like anger, sadness, happiness. You guys know this. If we're happier or if we're angry, if you're scared, your breath rate's going to go up. If you're more calm, more relaxed, your breath rate's going to go down, right? And we're talking emotionally. So that's kind of something to keep in mind there. But in general, like I said, ultimately these peripheral stimuli, minus central chemoreceptors, these stimuli essentially affect the respiratory centers of the medulla, therefore reflect or affecting activity essentially of the diaphragm, your main muscle of breathing. All right, and remember that the apneustic center, I'm just going to abbreviate this, the apneustic center basically has stimulatory effects on the respiratory center, and I'm just going to abbreviate, pneumotaxic center has essentially inhibitory effects as well. So that's kind of something to keep in mind. So all of this stuff essentially influences breathing. However, as I mentioned in the previous slide, like I said before, chemoreceptors, or basically blood chemistry, exerts the largest control over breathing. More specifically, the chemistry associated with pH and CO2. Okay, and chemoreceptors that are sensitive to changes in body fluid chemistry are located centrally in the medulla oblongata, or peripherally, again, where I mentioned before, in the aortic arch and carotid bodies. All right, now essentially how they work is that they're sensitive. These chemoreceptors are sensitive to hydrogen ion concentration. Okay, they're not sensitive to carbon dioxide. But remember, let's review how carbon dioxide is primarily transported throughout the body. carbon dioxide mixes when carbon dioxide mixes with water, you form carbonic acid, H2CO3, a weak acid that very easily gets rid of its hydrogen ion, thus leaving us with bicarbonate and hydrogen ions. So the more CO2 we accumulate in our system, the more we're going to build up hydrogen ions in our system, thus lowering our pH, making our body fluids more acidic, right? So you know this then. As a result, what's going to happen here? What's going to happen here? As we accumulate CO2 in the system and we build up our hydrogen ion concentration as a result of that, that's going to decrease the pH of your body fluids. And how are we going to have to compensate for that? We are going to have to increase our breath rate to try to get rid of that excessive amount of CO2, right? So that's kind of something to keep in mind. Now, when we think of central chemoreceptors, these are a little different because hydrogen ions cannot hydrogen ions in the blood cannot cross the blood-brain barrier. Okay, hydrogen cannot get across the blood-brain barrier. Okay. However, so basically, central chemoreceptors are not affected by hydrogen ion concentration in the blood. What they're affected by is carbon dioxide, because CO2 can, like it doesn't even exist, can freely pass across or through the blood-brain barrier, and and get into the cerebral spinal fluid. Now, remember when we're talking about getting into CSF and fluids, basically we're talking about combining CO2 and water. And once this gets into the CSF of the brain, we're going to form carbonic acid. And remember, this carbonic acid is going to very easily give up its hydrogen ions. And that is how we increase the hydrogen ion concentration in the medulla, where the central receptors are located. This is a very powerful control over breathing. All right, when we start exercising, this is how our breath rate starts to really quickly go up. All right, and this essentially, like I said, is a very key aspect of balancing pH, because essentially this is how we try to balance our pH by essentially washing out that excess carbon dioxide by getting it out of the blood and breathing it out. Because remember, accumulating carbon dioxide is going to cause an accumulation of hydrogen ions. All right. So that's essentially how central chemoreceptors work. The peripheral chemoreceptors are a little different. Basically, what happens here is when you have an increase in your PCO2, partial pressure or concentration of carbon dioxide, that's going to essentially cause a drop in your blood pH, right? And then basically, as your blood pH drops, that is there. So basically, when I say blood, I'm talking about peripheral blood. And what's going to happen then is that's going to start to set off the peripheral chemoreceptors. Okay, so basically, what's going to happen then are those peripheral chemoreceptors are going to start generating action potentials to the medulla, to the respiratory center, and then basically what's going to happen there is we're going to have increased outflow through the phrenic nerve, and therefore we're going to have increased diaphragm activity, meaning our breath rate's going to go up. All right, so we're going to start to hyperventilate to get rid of that excess CO2 buildup. And eventually, now this is a form of negative feedback, because once we balance ourselves out, once we wash out enough CO2 to bring balance back to our pH, that essentially is going to cause your breath rate to go back down. All right, excuse me. That's going to cause your breath rate to go back down, because remember, when we're talking about breathing, remember ventilation perfusion coupling. I know it's a topic we're visiting a lot, but as your breath rate goes up and your heart rate goes up and you're circulating more blood throughout the system, you're essentially going to wind up creating more bicarbonate as a result of that. You're gonna you're going to send more blood to your lungs to get rid of more CO2. I mean, there's a handful of reasons as to why this is going to balance out your pH. All right, but that's essentially how peripheral chemoreceptors work. Now, the thing to think about here then is oxygen. I haven't really said much about oxygen. And the thing is, like I said before, chemoreceptors are not that sensitive to oxygen. They're not that sensitive to them at all. Okay, so and like I said, a big reason why is just because most of the oxygen in the blood is in the form of oxyhemoglobin, right? It's stuck to hemoglobin. So the chemoreceptors don't really come in contact with oxygen that well. All right, so essentially, that's going to cause. So like I said, that's going to cause us to be not very sensitive to that. All right, I mean we have to have some pretty extreme changes in our oxygen content. For example, in your arteries, there's a partial pressure of 100 millimeters of mercury of oxygen in our blood. I mean, before we really start to see any major response in ventilation due to a drop in oxygen, we almost have to cut that in half. We almost have to cut our oxygen concentration in half down to partial pressure of 50 millimeters of mercury. That's a very extreme change. However, changes in pH are very easy to come by. So like I said, our we indirectly regulate oxygen by regulating carbon dioxide, essentially, because as we accumulate more CO2 and hydrogen, that's going to cause a drop in oxygen as well. All right. But that's just kind of something to keep in mind about all that. But in a very general nutshell, this is essentially how we neurologically regulate the process of breathing. And yeah, I honestly don't have a whole lot more to say to that because it's been an incredibly long day and it's time to go to bed. But hopefully this helps. If you have any questions, feel free to ask and take care.